A silver mist draped itself over the narrow rooftops of Paris, curling through chimney stacks like breath on a cold morning. It softened the sharp corners of stone and timber, wrapped the gargoyles in damp shawls, and muffled the bells of Saint-Jacques as they tolled a lazy, echoing hour. Beneath this veil, the city stirred, but only gently. Candlelight flickered behind shuttered windows. A cat padded silently across a courtyard. Somewhere in the distance, the slow rhythm of hooves tapped along the bridge to the Ile de la Cité. It was the year 1310, and the city was wrapped not only in mist, but in rules. Rules that stretched like threads through every alley and avenue. There were laws for bread and laws for buttons, laws for how wide a sleeve could be, and laws for how much lace might kiss a collar. But perhaps the quietest law of all was this. In Paris, not just anyone could wear red. Red was more than a color, it was a signal. A whisper of wealth, a glimmer of power, a memory of spilled wine or sacred fire. It was not for the poor, nor for the modest. Red belonged to the privileged few, granted by parchment, by coin, or by crown. And if you were seen in crimson without permission, well, the punishment was not always loud. Often it came in silence, a door that no longer opened, a customer who stopped returning, a fine folded under your bread. In the hush of this ancient city, where even the sane moved slowly through the fog, stories of cloth and color passed quietly from tailor to apprentice, from spinner to dyer. They were soft stories, stitched with longing, hemmed in secrecy. So come now, let the fire crackle low, let your breath slow with the fog, and your thoughts fall like leaves on the water. Tonight, we walk the worn stones of a city long vanished to uncover the quiet tale of a color both forbidden and desired. And so, our story begins. The streets of Paris in 1310 were narrow and uneven, shaped more by habit than by plan. Rainwater collected in their grooves, forming puddles that mirrored the clouds above, clouds often bruised with soot from 1,000 chimneys. In the early morning, the scent of coal and damp stone mingled with the yeasty sweetness of rising bread. Carriages creaked past shuttered stalls. A mongrel dog barked once, then fell silent again. Paris was a living patchwork, stitched from silk and ash, iron and parchment. In the richer quarters near the Palais de la Cité, noble women glided beneath velvet canopies, their gowns brushing the hem of privilege. In the poorer wards, children in hand-me-down wool tugged at their mothers' aprons, watching the wealthy pass with wide, silent eyes. Even in stillness, the city whispered with hierarchy. Everything had its place, its sound, its scent, and so did its color. You see, clothing was more than mere protection from wind and rain. It was declaration, discipline, and boundary. To be seen in a particular fabric or hue was to place oneself within an invisible map of rank, not just who you were, but who you dared to become. There were whispers that a man once wore embroidered sleeves too wide for his class and found his house egged by night. Another, it was said, lost customers after donning a green too bright for a butcher. These tales were rarely written down, yet everyone seemed to know them. Color, in particular, carried quiet power, and red was the loudest whisper of them all. But for now, the day remains gray and slow. The baker pulls open his shutters with a grunt. A washerwoman pours steaming water into a wooden tub, humming something low and tuneless. Overhead, a pair of sparrows flutters from the eaves, wings catching what little morning light there is. And down the Rue de Lombards, a merchant pauses to adjust his cloak. His threadbare wool is a modest brown, fading at the hem, but if one looked closely, very closely, they might catch a glimpse of stitching long since faded, that once perhaps had been red. The city continues, unaware of the stories hidden in every scene. In this city of stone and shadow, cloth was a language spoken in threads and hues. The rich wore fabrics that whispered wealth, velvet, silk, and damask woven with delicate care. The poor wrapped themselves in coarse wool or rough linen, dyed with mud and bark. Yet it was never simply about warmth or fashion. It was about order, a silent choreography of class. Sumptuary laws, as they were known, governed these choices. They were not written to oppress, some said, but to preserve harmony, to keep the fragile balance between who could wear what, when, and where. These laws were a kind of tapestry themselves, woven from fear and tradition, from reverence and control. A peasant might dream of crimson sleeves or scarlet cloaks, but the law whispered back, not for you. The noble classes alone were allowed to wrap themselves in the bold colors that marked their place above the common crowd. The colors were shields, banners, and badges, all woven into fabric. In the marketplace, merchants spoke in hushed tones about these laws. They knew that selling the wrong shade of dye or the wrong fabric could lead to fines or worse, a loss of reputation that meant ruin. A tailor might nervously finger a bolt of crimson cloth, hesitating before cutting, aware that a careless stitch could invite the king's displeasure. And so, even as the city bustled with life and trade, a quiet tension lingered beneath the surface, woven like invisible threads between each garment worn. For color was not merely decoration, it was a promise made visible, a boundary carefully drawn between the many and the few. The sun moved slowly over tiled roofs. Smoke curled from chimneys, weaving a smoky veil above the narrow streets. Somewhere a lute played a soft tune, its notes drifting like fallen leaves. And beneath it all, the fabric of society held fast, stitched tight with rules whispered in dye and cloth. Red was unlike any other color in the city's palette. It carried the warmth of flame, the pulse of life, and the quiet echo of danger. To see red was to see a story whispered across centuries of power, passion, and sacred rites. It was the color of noble robes, of the cardinal's vestments, and of the rich wines poured at feasts beneath glittering chandeliers. But in 1310 Paris, red was a privilege carefully guarded, a flame kept under watchful eyes. Only those granted royal permission could wear it openly, their permission sewn like a secret mark into the very fabric of their lives. To wear red without such grace was to risk more than scorn. It was to invite gentle but unyielding correction. The dye itself was a treasure, extracted from the root of the madder plant or the crushed bodies of tiny cochineal insects. The process was long and costly. Red cloth was heavy with value, not just in coin, but in symbolism. The flame in the fabric spoke of status and station, but also carried a whisper of sin and sacrifice. To the church, red was the color of both the Holy Spirit and of temptation. In the dim light of a tailor's workshop, bolts of red velvet and scarlet wool caught stray candlelight, flickering like embers. The tailor's apprentice watched with wide eyes, knowing these were fabrics not meant for common hands. Sometimes, in secret, a piece of thread or a scrap of cloth would find its way into the shadows of the city, hidden beneath cloaks or folded deep in pockets. Yet even as red burned bright in the halls of power, it remained a quiet rebellion when glimpsed in the marketplace or on a merchant's child. The forbidden flame flickered in places it should not be, softly daring the world to notice. Outside, a distant bell tolled the hour. The evening air held the scent of burning wood and cold stone, and the city seemed to hold its breath, wrapped in a red twilight of law and longing. In a small workshop tucked between timber-framed houses on a side street, a tailor worked late into the fading light. The soft scrape of scissors against fabric was nearly drowned beneath the muted murmur of the city settling for night. His hands, rough yet careful, moved over lengths of cloth with the practiced ease of years, sewing seams and hemming edges. Tonight, the tailor faced a quiet challenge, a request whispered through the marketplace and folded delicately into his ear. A wealthy merchant's mistress desired a gown, not just any gown, but one dyed a rich, deep red, the color of fire and forbidden promise. The tailor paused, holding a piece of fabric dyed with madder root, its crimson glow seeming almost too bright under the flickering candlelight. He knew the laws well. To craft such a garment without royal permission was to tread a delicate line, a crime whispered more than shouted, but with consequences no less certain. The risk was subtle yet real. A fine might be imposed, or worse, a warning passed along that could silence future commissions. Yet the promise of coin was tempting, as was the chance to see his craft worn proudly through the city's streets. He ran his fingers softly over the cloth, imagining how it would catch the light in a ballroom, how the mistress might glide through the shadows in such a gown. A quiet longing stirred within him, not for wealth, but for the freedom to shape beauty without fear. Outside, a breeze stirred the lanterns, casting dancing shadows on the worn stones. Somewhere nearby, a cat padded softly over a rooftop, its steps as careful as the tailor's own. The city held its breath, waiting for a decision sewn not just from thread, but from courage. And so the tailor leaned closer to his work, choosing each stitch with care, knowing that sometimes even silence held the weight of defiance. The art of dyeing cloth was an ancient one, whispered down through generations like a cherished secret. In the quiet corners of Paris, behind shuttered windows and beneath thatched roofs, dyers worked patiently with plants and insects, drawing color from the earth itself. Two hues ruled the dyeing world: the cool, dusty blue of woad, and the fiery, warm red born of madder root. While blue was plentiful and common, red was a treasure that coaxed carefully from roots and tiny cochineal bugs that seemed almost like magic trapped in glass jars. The process was slow and delicate. Madder roots were harvested, dried, crushed, and simmered in pots over smoldering fires, their deep crimson essence bleeding into the water. Cloth was soaked and lifted again and again, each dip deepening the shade until it sang with richness. The scent was earthy and faintly sweet, a reminder of hidden gardens and sun-warmed soil. Dyers guarded their recipes closely, passing their knowledge with hushed reverence. To wear a true red meant you carried the earth's warmth woven through your garments, a warmth few could afford. In the marketplace, bolts of cloth dyed with madder glowed softly in the sunlight, their red hues ranging from gentle rose to fierce scarlet. Children reached out with curious fingers, unaware of the silent laws that marked this color as forbidden for many. As evening settled, the dyer tended his pots, steam curling like ghostly fingers into the cool air. The city grew quiet around him, and in the fading light, the rich reds shimmered like embers waiting to be kindled. In the winding lanes behind the bustling stalls of the market, where the clatter of merchants' calls softened to murmurs, a quieter commerce took place. Here, beneath patchwork awnings and beside cracked stone fountains, forbidden fabrics exchanged hands in the hush of whispered trust. Scarves of deep crimson, too bold for common wear, folded like secret promises in the palms of nervous buyers. A merchant might glance over his shoulder before slipping a bolt of scarlet cloth beneath his coarse cloak. A seamstress would tuck a swatch of red velvet into her basket, her eyes darting to shadows as if the cloth itself might betray her. These were the soft rebellions of a city bound by color's rules. Little acts of defiance sown in silence. The scents of crushed herbs and baked bread mingled with the faintest trace of dye and damp wool. Laughter flickered like candlelight, quick and warm, as neighbors exchanged quiet news of who had dared to wear a forbidden shade. In these moments, red was not just color, it was a whispered longing, a shimmer of hope beneath the watchful eyes of law. And though the risk lingered like a shadow, the warmth of that flame drew many close. As dusk deepened, lanterns were lit one by one, their amber glow flickering over stone walls and stained glass. The market grew still, but the whispers of secret scarves wove their way through the city's veins, soft as a lullaby sung to the night. On quiet mornings, when the air still clung to the dew of night and the cobblestones shimmered faintly beneath worn boots, the town crier would arrive at the square. He came not with pomp, but with purpose, his scrolls curled like sleeping petals in his hands, his voice practiced into something calm and steady. From the steps of the Hôtel de Ville or beside the well near Saint-Gervais, he would unroll the parchment and speak into the hush of the crowd. "These are the statutes set forth by His Majesty and the court," he would begin, his voice drifting across bakeries and butchers, shoemakers and scribes. "That no man of the merchant class shall wear silk dyed in crimson, that no woman, unless of noble rank, shall don red upon her sleeves or hem." The people stood and listened, not always with fear, but often with resignation. A washerwoman paused, her basket pressed against her hip, frowning faintly at the decree. A journeyman tailor scratched at his beard and said nothing, the words forming quiet folds in his thoughts. These laws, known as sumptuary, were meant to preserve the hierarchy of appearance. They wrapped society in the language of fabric, sewing class into seams and status into color. They claimed to bring order, yet what they stirred in many was a gentle defiance. After the crier's voice fell silent, the scroll was rolled once more, and the square resumed its rhythm. Boots tapping, bells tolling, pigeons lifting skyward in a burst of feathers and morning light. But somewhere in the gathering crowd, someone would look down at their sleeves and wonder, what harm lies in beauty? What threat blooms in red? And as the square emptied and the wind tugged at hanging banners, the law hung heavier than words. It lived not just on parchment, but in glances, in gossip, in the choices made behind drawn curtains. On quiet mornings, when the air still clung to the dew of night and the cobblestones shimmered faintly beneath worn boots, the town crier would arrive at the square. He came not with pomp, but with purpose. His scrolls curled like sleeping petals in his hands, his voice practiced into something calm and steady. From the steps of the Hôtel de Ville, or beside the well near Saint-Gervais, he would unroll the parchment and speak into the hush of the crowd. "These are the statutes set forth by His Majesty and the court," he would begin, his voice drifting across bakeries and butchers, shoemakers and scribes. "That no man of the merchant class shall wear silk dyed in crimson. That no woman, unless of noble rank, shall don red upon her sleeves or hem." The people stood and listened, not always with fear, but often with resignation. A washerwoman paused, her basket pressed against her hip, frowning faintly at the decree. A journeyman tailor scratched at his beard and said nothing, the words forming quiet folds in his thoughts. These laws, known as sumptuary, were meant to preserve the hierarchy of appearance. They wrapped society in the language of fabric, sewing class into seams and status into color. They claimed to bring order, yet what they stirred in many was a gentle defiance. After the crier's voice fell silent, the scroll was rolled once more, and the square resumed its rhythm. Boots tapping, bells tolling, pigeons lifting skyward in a burst of feathers and morning light. But somewhere in the gathering crowd, someone would look down at their sleeves and wonder what harm lies in beauty, what threat blooms in red. And as the square emptied and the wind tugged at hanging banners, the law hung heavier than words. It lived not just on parchment, but in glances, in gossip, in the choices made behind drawn curtains. Evening fell like velvet over the rooftops, soft and full, folding the city in shadow. In the grand hall of a stone manor just off the Rue Saint-Honoré, lanterns bloomed like golden blossoms, and a hush of anticipation filled the air. Tonight, a feast would be held in honor of a visiting dignitary, an occasion scented with rosemary and rosewater, lit by candle and polished pride. They arrived one by one, the nobility, cloaked in layers of finery, their garments rustling like distant leaves in the wind. Silk gowns shimmered beneath fur-lined cloaks, gloves clutched goblets of spiced wine, embroidered shoes kissed the floor as they walked. And then she entered, a noble woman of quiet reputation, yet impossible now to ignore. Her gown, red deep as garnet, rich as flame, swept across the floor like a tide of fire. The candlelight caught its folds and danced upon them, casting flickers across the ceiling beams and catching in the eyes of all who looked. Conversation fell for a moment, not in scandal, but in reverence. For this red was not defiant, not borrowed, not stolen in a corner of the market. It was allowed, legal, bestowed, earned. The hue declared her station louder than any herald's cry. Here was a woman whose family bore ancient titles, whose name carried weight. She did not need to raise her voice. Her dress had spoken first. And yet, even those with the right to wear it often did so sparingly. For red did not simply flatter, it demanded. It told stories, both sacred and sinful. It was the color of martyrdom, of carnal temptation, of divine blood and royal seal. As she moved through the hall, others gave way, not from fear but from instinct. The red commanded space. Her silk sleeves brushed the stone table, leaving a whisper of perfume and privilege behind. A servant poured wine with steady hands, careful not to let a drop mar the dress. And in the corner, a young apprentice watched, eyes wide, imprinting the moment into memory. He would return to his workshop and try in vain to recreate that shade from imagination alone. But no dye could fully match the memory of that dress, the weight of it, the silence it carried, the story it told. Outside, the night deepened. Horses waited in courtyards. The stars turned slowly overhead. And in the warm hall, the lady in red sat at the head of the table, the color of her gown glowing like a hearth flame, legal and luminous. The dye merchants knew better than anyone. Not all reds were created equal. Behind every crimson cloak or scarlet gown lay a trail, of beetles crushed, of silk boiled, of coin exchanged in silence behind shuttered stalls. To the untrained eye, red was just red. But to those in the trade, it was a spectrum of power, each hue a rung on the ladder of status. The finest red? That belonged to cochineal, imported from distant lands, extracted from insects harvested in the heat of the New World. It was rich, deep, and stubborn, clinging to fabric like a promise. Reserved for royalty, for high clergy, for those who could pay not only the price in gold, but the toll in waiting. Closer to home, dyers worked with madder root, cheaper but paler, more fleeting. A poor man's red. It bled in the wash. It faded in the sun. And it told its own story. A story of ambition, just slightly out of reach. To wear a red you couldn't afford was a risk. Sumptuary laws didn't just police your purse, they policed your place. A weaver's daughter caught in a scarlet ribbon might be fined. A merchant's wife in a crimson shawl could be stripped of it in the market square. So the dye merchants watched and listened. They knew who wore what and when. They whispered of tailors arrested, of fabrics confiscated, of guilds punished for overstepping. They mixed their vats in guarded workshops, sealed their recipes with silence, and passed down the secrets like treasure maps. A young apprentice, hands stained ruddy with matter and lie, might dream of discovering the perfect shade, the one that slipped past the eye of the law but still turned heads in the street. A loophole in color, a revolution in hue. But such dreams were dangerous. For in the world of medieval Paris, red was not merely color. It was a code. And codes, once broken, often carried a cost. In a quiet workshop behind a wooden door warped with age, a young apprentice stood before his master's table, a bundle of cloth in his arms, and a hope too delicate to name resting in his chest. He had worked in silence for nearly 3 years, sweeping floors, fetching needles, warming dye pots with trembling hands. He'd stitched cuffs until his fingers ached, watched his master cut and shape with a precision that felt like magic. And now, at last, he had been given leave to sew his very first cloak. The wool was simple, undyed, coarse, humble, nothing rare. But to the apprentice, it might as well have been silk. His hands hovered reverently over the fabric, mapping out seams before the first cut, whispering the steps aloud like a prayer. As he worked, his mind wandered. He thought of the noblewoman in red he had once glimpsed from the shadows of a carriage arch, her dress trailing behind her like spilled wine. He remembered how the light had struck her sleeve, how it had made his breath catch, how the color seemed alive. And now, though he knew he must not, he dreamed of adding something, just a thread. A single line of color hidden beneath the collar where no one might see. A mark, not of rebellion, but of longing, of belonging. He rummaged through a jar of discarded threads, fingers brushing over dull browns and tired grays, until, near the bottom, he found it. A sliver of something richer, faded now but once red. A thread no thicker than a whisper. He hesitated. Outside, a winter wind pressed against the shutters, rattling them like a soft warning. The fire in the hearth hissed, throwing a warm flicker against the walls, and still he stood, thread in hand, his heart beating not with fear, but with wonder. In the end, he did not sew it in, but he kept it, wrapped gently in a square of linen, but he tucked into the fold of his cloak, a secret ember carried with him always. Not a statement, not a crime, just a dream dyed red. In a modest workshop filled with the quiet hum of spinning wheels and the soft click of looms, a weaver worked as twilight settled over Paris. Threads of wool and flax hung like gentle rainbows, waiting to be woven into cloth that might one day warm shoulders or adorn a child. The weaver's hands moved with practiced ease, threading and pulling, weaving life into fabric with every pass. Tonight, however, her mind was elsewhere, caught on a single thought that fluttered like a moth's wing. She had mixed a dye that day, a shade a little too bold, a little too close to the forbidden red, a blush that shimmered like a shy secret in the dim light. The fabric soaked up the color greedily, and as it dried, it glowed softly like embers fading at dawn. It was just a thread, a tiny whisper of color woven into the larger whole. But to the weaver, it was everything. A gentle act of courage stitched quietly into her craft. She watched the cloth hang by the window, catching the last gold of day. The blush seemed to pulse softly, alive with possibility. She wondered, briefly, who might one day wear this cloth, unaware of the small rebellion nestled in its fibers. Outside, footsteps echoed faintly on the cobblestones, and the bells of Saint-Germain tolled in the distance. The air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke, carrying with it the softness of evening, and in that quiet workshop beneath the hum of the loom, a secret blush held its place, a tender spark of color in a city ruled by whispers. In the heart of the city, where stone walls whispered tales of kings and queens, red was more than color. It was a symbol of royal favor, a silent permission stitched into the very fabric of power. Only those who bore the king's blessing might don the deepest crimsons, the richest scarlets. A knight's cloak trimmed in fiery thread marked his service to crown and country. A merchant granted a rare license might wear a sash dyed in ruby hues, signaling his standing beyond the ordinary. These royal insignias were both shield and banner, granting passage through a world ruled by rules woven from silk and decree. They transformed mere cloth into tokens of trust and honor. In the glow of a flickering hearth, a nobleman adjusted the heavy folds of his red-trimmed cloak, feeling its weight settle comfortably across his shoulders. It was more than warmth, it was identity. A legacy passed down from ancestors who had earned the right to walk beside kings. The city's watchful eyes knew these marks well. They spoke silently of hierarchy, of duty, of the threads that bound a realm together. Yet even in these colors there was a quiet humility, an understanding that the crimson worn today carried the memory of battles fought, promises kept, and power granted with care. As twilight folded the city into shadows, the red of royal insignia glowed softly beneath torchlight, a whisper of authority carried gently through the night. Within the soaring arches of the cathedral, the flickering candlelight played softly upon walls carved with prayer and history. The air was thick with the scent of incense, sweet, heavy, and lingering, wrapping the space in a gentle haze where shadow and light danced quietly. Here, red was both sacred and solemn. The bishop's robes, rich velvet embroidered with golden thread, moved with a stately grace as he glided across the stone floor. Each fold caught the soft glow of the candles, casting velvet shadows that seemed to whisper ancient secrets. This red was not the vibrant flame of forbidden cloth, but a deeper, more mysterious hue, one that spoke of sacrifice, devotion, and the weight of faith. It wrapped the bishop like a mantle of responsibility, a symbol that stretched beyond the flesh to touch the divine. The choir's soft chants filled the nave, their melodies weaving through the columns like a gentle breeze. Sunlight filtered through stained glass, bathing the sanctuary in pools of ruby and amethyst. The colors shimmered on the polished wood and worn stone, mingling with the warmth of flickering flames. As the bishop paused before the altar, he raised his hands in silent prayer, the folds of his robe trailing like whispers upon the floor. Around him, the congregation bowed their heads, enraptured by the sacred ritual. In this place, red was a color of reverence, both a reminder of human frailty and the burning hope of salvation. It held the stories of saints and sinners alike, a gentle reminder that even in shadow, light could be found. Outside, the city's murmur softened, as if respectful of the solemnity within these walls. And within the cathedral, the bishop's robes and velvet shadows told a tale as old as time itself. In the soft twilight of Parisian streets, where lanterns flickered like distant stars, there came a moment when wearing red without permission was more than just a quiet defiance. It became a gentle crime. Stories traveled like whispers on the wind, telling of a humble merchant's wife who once dared to drape herself in a crimson scarf too bright for her station. It was a subtle thread, caught briefly beneath the folds of her woolen cloak, but enough to draw the eye of the city's watchful guardians. She was not punished with harsh words or public scorn. Instead, a quiet visit came, an invitation to remove the forbidden color, a soft warning folded in velvet tones. Her scarves were taken, folded carefully, and returned when the law's weight had lessened. Business slowed for a time, neighbors offered cautious glances. In another tale, a young apprentice was reprimanded for sewing a thread of red into a sleeve. His punishment was measured, not cruel but firm, a reminder that boundaries existed even in the smallest stitches. These moments were not loud, but their echoes lingered. They spoke of a world where color was law and law was color. The city, wrapped in mist and shadow, seemed to hold its breath, watching as the threads of rebellion were pulled quietly one by one. Yet beneath the surface, a softer secret grew, an understanding that beauty, even when forbidden, could not be entirely controlled. The moon rose slowly above the rooftops, casting silver light on empty streets and shuttered windows. In the hush, the faintest hint of crimson glowed like a memory, soft, elusive, and ever-present. Far beyond the walls of Paris, whispers of change drifted on the breeze, carried from village to town, from market to manor. In other cities, other kingdoms, the tightly woven rules of color and cloth began to loosen. unraveling slowly like the worn threads of an old tapestry. There were places where merchants dyed their fabrics in deeper reds, where the merchant class dared to stitch trims once reserved for nobles. Soft rebellions bloomed quietly, almost unnoticed, beneath the watchful eyes of tradition. These shifts were like shadows lengthening at dusk, gradual and inevitable. The rigid boundaries that had held society's colors in place began to blur, faded edges of a world that was changing in small, persistent ways. In Paris, too, some felt the stirrings. A secret scarf slipped in the marketplace, a richer thread woven into humble sleeves, a merchant daring to wear a scarlet ribbon beneath his cloak. These acts were gentle ripples in the still pond of custom. The city's ancient stones seemed to sigh beneath the weight of centuries, as if sensing the slow breath of transformation. Even the Seine carried the news in its steady flow, murmuring stories of a future where color might speak differently. As night deepened and stars kindled softly above the rooftops, the city rested in a quiet balance between old laws and new dreams, between the flame of tradition and the whisper of change. And so the threads began to loosen, one by one, weaving a story not yet finished but forever unfolding. When the city of Paris slipped into night, and the last murmurs of the day faded into silence, the night watchmen began their quiet rounds. Cloaked in dark wool, their footsteps fell softly upon the cobblestones, their lanterns casting pools of amber light that wavered like gentle flames against the stone walls. The streets, now emptied of bustling crowds, felt both peaceful and watchful, a world suspended between dream and waking. The watchmen moved with steady purpose, their eyes scanning shadows and doorways, their breath misting in the cool air. Beneath the silver glow of the moon, cloaks brushed softly as the citizens of the night moved cautiously. Among them, there was a woman wrapped in deep fabric, her steps light but sure. The red scarf hidden beneath her cloak was a silent rebellion, a secret flame tucked close to her heart. The watchmen knew of such things, of colors that dared to gleam where they should not. Yet their enforcement was tempered with understanding, a gentle caution rather than harsh decree. Often the punishment was a whispered warning, a quiet request to fold the forbidden cloth away until dawn. The city, bathed in moonlight, held its breath in this delicate balance between law and longing, between shadow and light. The night watchmen and the cloaks they passed were part of the same story, woven together in threads of silence and soft resistance. And as the hours stretched thin and the city's pulse slowed to a calm rhythm, even the moon seemed to smile down upon these quiet guardians of color and custom. In a humble home near the river's edge, where the scent of fresh linen mingled with the tang of tannery, lived the dyer's daughter. Her days were spent amid pots of bubbling colors, watching as her father coaxed hues from earth and insect with patient hands. She knew the language of dye, how the madder root bled its secret red into steaming, how the chenille insects lent a delicate blush to wool and silk. She understood the magic woven into every bolt of cloth. Yet, she also understood the quiet sorrow hidden in those colors, the knowledge that some shades were forbidden, wrapped in laws and silence. Red, especially, was a color both treasured and feared, a flame kept safely away from those who might dream too brightly. At night, by the glow of a flickering candle, the daughter would weave small scraps of forbidden red thread into a cloth meant for no one but herself, a secret tapestry stitched in quiet defiance and tender longing. Her dreams were painted in hues of crimson and rose, visions of vibrant gowns and scarves fluttering in the breeze, of a world where color was not a chain but a song. Outside, the Seine murmured softly beneath the stars, carrying her dreams along its winding path. The city slept, wrapped in shadows and stories, while the dyer's daughter held close her quiet rebellion, a thread of red in a world of muted tones.